Hey everybody, CyberTao back with you with all things chess. We're continuing our examination of hanging pawns. We're going to look at a fairly classic example. The analysis is going to be a little bit light. I highlighted the key moments, but it's a little bit longer of a game. Plus, it's one of the most famous games in world chess history. So it's really difficult to break new ground in a game like this. It's pretty much been covered in every way possible. But I did want to highlight this game because it's an important one to have in your database. Plus, it's very thematic for hanging pawns and how to fight against hanging pawns. This is Robert James Fischer, also known as Bobby Fischer, against Fischer-Spassky in their 72 match. This was Game 6. My opinion, one of the most beautiful positional games ever played, just in terms of the logic being linked move to move. When Bobby Fischer was allowed to play chess like that, he was completely unstoppable. He was weaker in irrational positions, but most people are, so that's no mark against him. C4. Fairly surprising at the time, because he, of course, was notorious for saying that e4 was best by test. Korchnoi and a couple of lonely voices in the wilderness tried to warn Spassky that Fischer was probably going to expand his repertoire for this World Championship match. In tournaments just before the match, Fischer had played lots of moves other than e4. There's a famous game against Polakevsky where he started at c4. It's called the Perfect or Peerless Draw. He played 1b3 in a few games and came up with a brand new idea in the Hedgehog and won some beautiful games. But really, this is the first notable instance of Bobby Fischer playing something other than e4 on move 1 as white. And you can tell by the way Spassky conducted the game that he was pretty surprised. So e6... d4. If we wanted to say completely hypermodern, this is my main repertoire. This would be the ready opening. It used to be fairly theory light. Now, unfortunately, stronger players have gotten a hold of this position, and there's a lot more work to be done here, so I might be shifting to something a little bit, but it's hard to avoid theory nowadays, so maybe I just put my big boy pants on for once and work. So, but d4 goes straight into the Queen's Gambit declined. c3, bishop g5. So this line really starts with Harry Nelson Pillsbury back at the turn of the 20th century in the 1910s. He did an enormous amount of theoretical work and practical work in games in turning this bishop g5 move into a fierce weapon. Before then, it had been sporadically played. Bishop f4 was just likely to be played. Also, e3 was likely to be played. They just didn't know what the key moves were back at that period. But Harry Nelson Pillsbury was the first really strong player to establish bishop g5 as the critical move here. So castle, e3. This is all super main line stuff. h6. The other most popular move is knight bd7. It's fair to say this one's a little bit more passive. Black just immediately develops. The nice part about h6 is that you immediately gain that tempo on the bishop, so you're guaranteed to always have that tempo gain, and then you can go about your business. Bishop h4, b6. So this is the Cadillac of is sort of a overused phrase in my opinion, but this truly is one of the Cadillac openings of chess. This is the Tartakover, Makaganov, Bondarevsky line. Sometimes it's shortened to just the Tartakover or to the TMB. This is aligned with just an incredible World Championship pedigree. World champions have fought on both sides of the board with this opening. It's one of those openings that truly, if you take it up and really learn the nuances, you will become a better chess player. This is an opening that's firmly established in the DNA of chess. The other main move here, knight e4, this is the Lasker. This was Lasker's attempt to try to improve on some of Capablanca's relieving methods, and the Queen's Gambit declines. The main line here. And White definitely has an edge. I mean, you look at White's development, it's very free and easy. Black has this bad bishop on c8, and it truly is a bad bishop. But Black's position is quite solid. Black has managed to trade 2 sets of minor pieces off the board, which typically helps when you're low on space, which Black is. And it's hard for White to suppress both of Black's pawn breaks. Both c5 and e5 will be key pawn breaks for Black. And it's hard for White to control both those pawn breaks. So, knight e4, it's a perfectly viable move. b6, I would say, has the more established pedigree. I would say world champions are more likely to play b6 than knight e4. Not to say knight e4 is bad, just b6 has a more... I would say Black retains better counter chances at b6. cxd5. This was the common move back then. White's never really gained much with this move. And modern theory has mostly moved on to other moves. Rook c1. This is the highest scoring move, but it's hard to say that this move is better. And that's a mark for the Tartakover, not against White's play. It's just hard to find something good against the Tartakover. Rook c1 is another modern main line. Basically, the idea is you wait for bishop b7, and then you take on f6 and d5, and you try to claim that this bishop on b7 is a little bit misplaced because it's biting on the granite of Black's own pawn on d5. For saying all that, Black has the bishop pair, and it's likely that this position is going to open up with those hanging pawns advancing. White scores under 50% in this line. So it's hard to find a good line against the Tartakover just because it is a well-established line. Like there's no way to get an edge against it, in my opinion. But cxd5, I think, gives up the game a little bit too easily. So some pieces come off the board. That's helped the Black, of course. Rook c1, bishop e6. So the boon to this position for Black is that he can bring his bishop to e6 instead of b7, so it has a little bit more scope on e6. It's protecting the d5 pawn, but it still has that nice diagonal towards the king side available. Queen a4, this is a little bit more popular back in the 60s and 70s. Bishop d3 is the other modern main line, but after c5, this is another main line, but White really doesn't have anything here. Hanging pawns are a weakness if we can get pressure against them. That's the old saw. A weakness is only a weakness if you can attack it. White doesn't have a way of pressuring these hanging pawns just yet. In fact, without a way to pressure those hanging pawns are just controlling very valuable central space. This position's equal, but in my opinion, this would be an easier position to handle as Black, just because these pawns are mobile. c4 could come at an opportune time. Black can also gain more space on the queen side with a5, a4. It's hard to zone in on what White's plan here is supposed to be. So practically, theoretically equal, but I would say practically it's easier for Black. And that's reflected in the score. White scores well under 50% in this position. But queen a4, it's fine. It just doesn't accomplish a lot. c5, queen a3. So this is the idea. The queen puts itself in a weird square to try to pressure the pawn on c5. The downside is that you've cost 2 moves, and the piece you're investing the time with is your queen, which typically, the earlier you bring your queen out, the harder it is to justify that investment, because it's so much more likely that you're going to have to move that queen again and spend more time in the opening. Rook c8, bishop e5. This was hoped theory at the time. We just recognize it as a poor move now. It's been completely defanged, more than defanged. Bishop e2 is a more normal move, but even here, I would say the best move, it's not the most popular, but it scores the best, and the computer likes it the most. King f8, just a nice little quiet move. It's cleaning up the tactical nicety of this queen on e7 being undefended. So now cxd4 is an option in certain positions. One potential line. Again, these hanging pawns are not vulnerable. There's no way for White to generate pressure against these hanging pawns. And without a way to generate pressure against the hanging pawns, they're just controlling central space. These are just strong pawns gobbling up space in the center. So this would be another position where practically I think it's theoretically I think it's equal, but practically I take Black every day of the week. This is a very nice position for Black practically. But bishop e5 gives away the edge and more, in my opinion. a6, this isn't bad. Interesting story. So Spassky was sort of well known for his lack of efforts in opening preparation, which I completely sympathize with. I am a lazy sumbitch, so all credit to Boris Spassky. His main second for his match in Reykjavik in '72 was Efim Gauler, who one of the greatest players of all time, especially known for his incredible theoretical preparation. He is one of the best opening theoreticians of all time. The correct move here, queen b7, he had actually prepared for Spassky's match in '72. He told Spassky about the analysis, showed him the critical lines, but Spassky didn't play it. He played a6 at the board. Sort of the punchline to that strange bit of chess humor, Geller took it upon himself to simply introduce this move only a year after the match in Reykjavik against Tiemann in 1973 and absolutely demolished him in a classic game. The idea is, notice that white has to take this pawn on c5. If he just castles, these pawns are just going to start rolling down the board, and white's close to losing. So white has to take the pawn, but black gets humongous compensation. Now, this white king is absolutely stuck on the board. Rook c8 is coming later. This is worth more than a pawn. Queen a3, queen c4, king d2. This is a decisive error, more or less. Rook g1, and then d4. This is the classic isolated pawn blasting forward to open up lines. The route's on. Geller converted his advantage beautifully from here. He finished off with a trademark savage mating attack against the white king. Just absolutely beautiful game. Look it up in yourself. So Spassky had all this analysis on board, both literally and figuratively. Geller was his second. He told him all about it, and yet Spassky played the older move of a6. So it's hard to... if I remember my stories right, Spassky claimed that he'd forgotten the analysis at the board. But it's not that queen b7 is a hard move really to see. You just have to see that after knight a6, you're getting compensation for the pawn. So it's hard to see where really Spassky lost his nerve to play this move at the board. So, strange story. a6 isn't bad. I think this is still completely equal. So dx, castle, knight d7. This isn't an outright error, but it allows white to deploy an important positional device. So here, the position's completely equal. Again, these are hanging pawns that are under no pressure whatsoever. And if the hanging pawns aren't under pressure, they are just strong central pawns controlling squares. Knight d7 allows white to undertake a favorable positional transformation. Much better would be just queen f8. And then knight d4 isn't an option. And then black can play knight d7 the next move after that, and black has no problems whatsoever. So the problem with knight d7, knight d4. So obviously the pawn can't take because the queen in e7 is hanging. I'll just show that for everyone. But failing that, there's no place for this bishop to move. So white's going to be able to trade his knight for that bishop on e6. That is the sort of transformation that Bobby Fischer was very fond of. He loved taking the bishop against the knight. And it also transforms the pawn structure a little bit. Queen f8. This continues the drift. This is the first real mistake from black. Knight f6. This is better because now the pawn break with e4 is halted by the knight f6. And black is fine. Black is completely solid. In fact, black even has potential active plans with advancing those pawns to the center part of the board. Black is fine. Queen f8 continues the drift. And then e4. This is the move I really want to hone in on for this learning session. This pawn break against the hanging pawn is incredibly crucial, whether it's a sacrifice or not. And here, it's technically a sacrifice, but it's hard to say that's black's pawn structure would be really up pawn afterwards. But this pawn break against the hanging pawns is absolutely crucial. Again, if these pawns are not under pressure, they are just strong central pawns that are gobbling up central space. It is incumbent upon you when you're fighting against the hanging pawns to organize as much pressure against the hanging pawns as possible. e4 is that sort of move. You always want to be looking to your pawn breaks. e4 is the pawn break here that white is most interested in. And this is exactly the sort of pressure that you want to be gaining against the hanging pawns at all times. d4. This is close to the decisive mistake immediately. Black's position actually is just about fine still here. But he has to play... He's got a couple of options. I think, paradoxically, dx e4 is the best option. It looks ugly as all hell. So black's pawn structure is a wasteland. But I think black has enough activity to make it work. One potential line. I think white's positionally better. So if the position ever calms down, black's pawn structure is just going to be absolute Swiss cheese. But I think black's active knight, the outpost for that knight, it can maneuver itself to d4 potentially, and black can try to claim the d-file. Both those rooks can quickly double the d-file. I think that's enough to balance things. It's definitely a double-edged position, though. I think c4 is another move that looks nicer. It keeps the pawn structure more, far less ragged. I think white's a little bit better off here than the previous line with dxe4. I think this is still holdable for black, but I think white's the only one that can be better because of this long-term target on d5, plus the pawn break at d3. I think this is still holdable for black. This is still within the drawing margin, but I think white is definitely slightly better. But the game choice of d4 is just absolute positional suicide. This is exactly how you want the hanging pawns to be when you're fighting against the hanging pawns. Notice how they're blockaded now. Neither of those pawns can move. And they're no longer controlling squares, because all the light squares around those hanging pawns are complete. They're owned by white now, but especially because of that light squared bishop. So this is a decisive positional error. And from here on out, Fischer just plays nearly perfectly. This is absolutely gorgeous sequence. He was an absolute raving lunatic, and he shouldn't be a role model for anyone, but he played some darn good chess. F4, excellent move. Simply planning e5, locking that weakness on e6 in place, opening up the light squares to the king side. Exactly what you want to do. Queen e7, notice that e5 can't be played. Theoretically, you'd like to stop that e5 push, but after queen h3, this just completely ties black up, and then e6 will come, bishop c4. That's just lost. So queen e7, black has to be subjected to e5. And as soon as black is prevented from playing e5 to reinforce these pawns, now they're vulnerable to b4 pawn breaks, but mostly it's just this light square bishop is going to be a superstar now. All those light squares that those hanging pawns no longer control, that bishop controls. That's the strength of that pawn break, because it forces that hanging pawn to advance, and then you control all those squares. It's when the hanging pawns are standing next to each other that they're at their most dangerous, because that's when they're harmoniously controlling all the squares in front of them, they're controlling different color squares. When they're blockaded like this, when they're on the same color square, that's when that sort of blockade and that light square control is possible. And here, white has the perfect piece to take advantage of that. Rook b8. This is the final relevant mistake. After this, black is just dead lost. Knight b6 at least puts up resistance. It stops the bishop on e2 from going to c4. And at least tries to get the knight active at some point. This is still much better for white, though. So queen d3. This is just one potential line. f5, that's the logical pawn break. This is a very natural exchange sacrifice. Bishop b3, threatening mates and stuff. And white has far more than enough for exchange. I mean, this pawn on e6 is an absolute monster. You've always got mate threats zooming on the king's side. This is still a fight, though. Black can attempt to resist here. Rook b8. White just strangles black for free from this point. Queen h3. So just methodically tying black down to the e6 pawn before the f5 pawn break. Just perfect play from Fischer. b3. This isn't strictly necessary, but it's good chess. There's no reason to allow counterplay in a position like this. White owns all the trumps here, and black has no counterplay. So there's no reason to allow any random shots on b2. Fischer just plays perfectly logical chess here. a5, and then f5. Just going... Always look to your pawn breaks when you're looking at ways to break through. And f5 is the breakthrough move. Rook takes. Bring the other rook, perfectly logical. It's hard to give any variations here, just because Fischer is playing perfectly. This is exactly how you want to play a build-up. Queen g3, h4. Very nice little detail move. Just stops knight g5 from blocking any mate threats on g7, so when rook f7 comes, there's no knight g5 as a riposte. e6, another logical move. Black defended the f7 point, so white attacks it again. Perfect move. Queen e5, a little bit weak, not necessarily weak, but bishop d3 is stronger. Notice if the rook takes, queen x c7. The point of bishop d3 is it controls the h7 square, so now rook f8 comes with decisive effect if black takes that. But on queen g8, just queen d6, and this is decisive penetration. The rook's going to come to f7, and this is... yeah, this is over. Queen e8. a4. Fischer's just playing with his food here. a4 is not necessary at all, just queen e4. And black has no moves. Bishop d3 is going to come, and the game will be over. So Fischer's just sort of toying with Spassky at this point. Sort of maneuvering back and forth. And now with the threat of rook f8 check. but then white just takes the exchange, shatters open the black king side. Queen f4. White's just breaking through, and this is over. This is where Spassky resigned. This was they'd finally reached a time control. For those of you younger folks that have never used a wooden clock, there was such a thing as time controls. Yeah, this game is over. But really, the main point of the game... The point of the game that I'd like you to take away from this is that e4 pawn break. When you're fighting against the hanging pawns, you want to always be looking to pawn breaks. That e4 pawn break is so often the engine of the play against the hanging pawns, and here it came with absolutely decisive effect once those hanging pawns were blockaded. And then, from then on, Fischer played absolutely perfectly. So, model game from Fischer. We're going to continue with our examination of hanging pawns next time. My name is John. I'll see you later.